Hey, Joe.
Hey, how you doing?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Oh, I gotcha. Okay.
Okay, yeah, you're gonna have to give this mic a minute. It like has to
I
warm
can
up.
barely hear you, though.
You have to give this mic a minute to warm up in like a minute or two.
Okay.
If you want to go ahead and start, ready
Okay.
when yours.
Oh, you're good now. Hold on.
Okay, cool.
Go ahead. Okay. Sorry, had to grab some that tooth. So I've been homesick yesterday and today, but okay. So let's talk. Yeah, we're gonna discuss inflation. So this is a topic we agreed to quite some time ago. Am I pretty blurry?
Yeah, you definitely need to clean that.
I don't. I don't know. I don't know why that is, but
It's a little bit better.
okay.
Don't use your finger.
Use my shirt. Oh yeah, it looks better. Okay, interrupt your. Okay, so let's talk about inflation. So this is perhaps a disagreement we have that I argue that inflation is it's an economic negative. It's a bad thing. Inflation is much worse than deflation, despite the fact that most people think deflation is worse than inflation. And I would one say inflation is a disincentive to save. Inflation is it kills your purchasing power. Inflation is destructive in many ways. So I don't know if you want to pick up on that. You like inflation, is what you said before.
Okay, so yeah, I like inflation, but I don't like volatile inflation. So I have to make that absolutely clear to everyone. Nothing in this world is absolute. So I can't say inflation is absolutely good because if we had 100% inflation every other month or something crazy, then yes, it would be an absolutely destructive consequence. And the same could be said about deflation or disinflation for that matter. So I do want to make it clear that one of the arguments I'm making is the great moderation and Friedman's K% rule, that keeping a steady level around 1 to 2% inflation, um, within a 1 to 2% inflation range, not 1 to 2% inflation altogether, is the optimal rating. So inflation itself is not bad. It's just when inflation gets out of hand or when other problems come. But I think for the user or for the listener, I think we should define inflation.
Well, I mean, we can talk about like I would say inflation itself specifically is defined as the oversupply of money that results in higher prices. But we can just talk specifically about higher prices if you want.
Yeah,
So,
because I reject the
right,
idea that
right,
money.
I know you do, but it results in higher prices. So we can talk specifically about higher prices in and of itself. Is that the continual growth in prices, even if it were somewhat low of 1, 2, 3%, which it never is, but even if we were to hold it at like Milton Friedman talked about some kind of linking inflation or linking the growth of money to the population growth or some kind of constant rate rather than having some board of trustees deciding on a whim how much money that they want to create. Yeah, that would be a better idea than letting their subjective viewpoints. But still, I think inflation in any way, any amount of inflation, because it's harmful to savers and it eats away at your savings, and it means that you can't save money. It means you have to run around and try to invest, and investment means risk. And so you, by avoiding inflation and investing, means you're putting your money at risk. There was once a time when you could just hold on to money and it would hold its purchasing power over the long period. In fact, between 1812 and 1890, a dollar would have held its purchasing power by almost fully. So, what cost a dollar in about 1812 cost about $1.03 in 1890 versus what cost a dollar in 1912 now in 1990 cost about $24. So inflation, and it varied. Yes, it varied between approximately 0 and approximately 15% over the course of the last 100 years. But it's eaten away people's inflation. What it's caused is it's made people put their money at risk in the stock market and bonds and other things that are, by definition, risky assets.
Okay, so before I get into my point, I just want to define things a little bit more for the people watching. So inflation isn't just inflation. So there's multiple points of inflation. So we have demand side inflation, right? So demand side inflation, it either makes people better off in the short run, that's with higher real gross domestic product or higher real incomes, or has no effect at all, right? So we most of the time consider money as neutral, right? We've talked about this. So money is neutral in the long run. So it only has a short run effect, right? So whatever loss of, like, let's say we just agree that for every dollar there's gained, we lose $1 worth of a 50% value or something, right? So the amount of money in the system is equal to the price difference in the system. There is no change in the long run. So just because it's lost power, there's that much more money. So if, let's say, you're making 25 cents 50 years ago, this isn't actual numbers, and you're making 8.75 now, those can be the exact same amount of money with respect to how much goods cost, right? So I'm gonna put this at this right here. What I'm talking about applies to that savers are hurt by inflation argument, right? So let's assume savers buy long-term nominal bonds. Those bonds promise a fixed amount of money at specified future dates. The standard argument is that inflation hurts savers by reducing their real return on bonds. But savers don't care about the nominal interest rate minus the inflation rate. They care about the nominal interest rate minus the per capita nominal gross domestic product growth. I'll give you an example. Years ago, the British government indexed the initial starting point for retirement pensions to the cost of living, not average wages. The Thatcher reforms led to real increases in living standards in Great Britain. And so over time, the living standards of retirees fell further and further behind the living standards of the employed, who received nominal wage increases that exceeded inflation. Eventually, the old-timers looked at the flashy lifestyles of their younger neighbors and revolted. The UK government was forced to change the indexing scheme. People don't care about real incomes. They care about what they're doing relative to their neighbors. If nominal gross domestic product rises faster than expected, then a bondholder is paid back a smaller share of national income than he anticipated when he bought that bond. And that hurts, right? And then we can talk about the Fisher effect. The Fisher effect applies to nominal interest rates minus nominal gross domestic product growth, not minus inflation, right? So that's where I go back to on defining the idea of what inflation is. So what's currently held by some as what, and I believe that monetarists of the Friedman School make this case wrong, and I think that some neoclassical forms make this case wrong. I think I especially disagree with modern monetary theory and the post-Keynesians like Steve Keen. I think they're absolutely out of their mind when it comes to the real effect of the money illusion, of the Fisher effect, and things of that nature. So that's why I don't believe that savers are hurt by inflation. All right.
Okay, so you mentioned modern monetary theory, the idea that the government could just print money and pay for whatever it wanted. Even Krugman has written about how destructive that is because it's just going to hyperinflation. It is a ridiculous, insane. Yeah. But I would say that it is a fallacy to say that if inflation goes up by 4%, your wages go up by 4%. That's kind of ridiculous because inflation is it's more of an across the it's a generally across the board, but it is a number that's an aggregate.
I said demand side inflation, not cost push inflation. There is a difference between demand side and cost push.
We're talking about inflation as a changes in the monetary price across or of goods across the board in general.
But there is a difference, especially how it functions within the economy. So, like cost push inflation can occur when a product that is an input to another product increases in price or value because scarcity, but is not confined to like scarcity boundaries, but to certain factors of production, right? So that forces that cost to go up, and it may force all of these other products up, and therefore you have inflation. But that's cost push inflation.
Well, I would reject that as the idea of inflation, because you're talking about the price of some goods going up. That's not really inflation. It's just supply and demand in general. But inflation, well, again, I would define inflation as a growth in the monetary supply that causes a growth in the price. But if we're talking about, again, if we're just talking about a growth in the price of goods, then we're talking about a growth in the price of goods across the board. And you mentioned bonds. What is the bond? What does a bond pay today? What is a treasury bond pay? It's like 0.5%. Maybe you might get 1%. So if you're going to put your money in a bond, a so-called safe bond, what is the price of a bond? What can you get on a 10-year bond? It's very, very low. It is probably below it's close to the official inflation rate. So if you're going to put your money in a bond, then you can it's still somewhat risky, but you might be able to maintain your purchasing power of your money over time, but it's not really going to help you because inflation does change. And when you're putting your money into a 10, a 15, a 20-year bond, your interest rate is constant, whereas inflation is going to change over time. So it might be okay at 1% today. You're beating inflation of zero. Official inflation is zero. But in 10 years, that's going to be most likely well below the actual inflation rate. So again, you're hurting savers in the long run. Even in nominal, because you mentioned nominal prices. So I don't think anybody really cares that much about nominal. They might care today, but in the long run, nobody cares about nominal prices. They care about what their money buys. What can you buy with your money? I would take lottery winners. What do lottery winners usually do? They take the money up front. So they don't take it over the long run because they realize in 20 years, they don't know what the money is going to buy. So what is $20,000 a month for 20 years? What is $20,000 going to buy in 20 years? People take the money up front so that they can invest it. What they would see is more wisely than the payout in the long run payout. That would be something I would say that most lottery winners would do anyways, is they would take the money up front because they don't trust the purchasing power of the money in the long run. But Jen, again, I'm saying inflation as an across-the-board rise in prices. That's more specifically the kind of inflation that I think most people would think of, right?
Right. So I mentioned this earlier, and I want to go back to this idea, what's called the money illusion, right? So for those who don't know, money illusion or price illusion, it refers to the tendency of people to think of currency in nominal rather than real terms. In other words, the numerical face value, nominal value of money is mistaken for its purchasing power, real value at a previous point in the general price level in the past, right? This is a big problem when it comes to this debate. So what we have to talk about is you're talking about the money illusion or trying to get past the money illusion, right? You're not really going to get past the money illusion unless you're doing the metrics on a constant basis on what was the previous general price level, right? So you're going to be like, well, 20 years ago I used to be able to buy $5 of gas to fill me up for a week, and now it's not. That's inflation and stuff like that. And so you're thinking of it in nominal terms, and you're not really applying it to its real value, right? That's absolutely a bad thing to do. We have to get past that. That's where I went back to that monetary neutrality, right? So in the long run, money is equal to money, or inflation is equal to money supply. That's in the long run. And that's from a monetarist standpoint. And if I'm not mistaken, that's even a classical Austrian standpoint that they used to have, that they worry about the nominal shocks of now causing problems and things of that nature, right? So we've got like we've stepped our game up. We've got expectations augmented Phillips curve that states that in the short term, the trade-off between employment and inflation isn't 1-to-1. We know that if people are expecting the inflation to happen, it's not going to have any difference on employment, right? It's not going to cut unemployment down. It's not going to create more jobs. If we don't expect that inflation rate to just spike up out of nowhere and raise the standard of living in a very short time, because wages are sticky, right? So we have that idea. We know that that is true. That is empirically true, that we have tested time and time again. It goes back to Milton Friedman's natural rate of employment hypothesis, right? So there is a natural rate of unemployment. So now let's talk about.
Let's talk about the Phillips curve. I mean, I would say that the Phillips curve, in the immediate, it works, but there's always a lag. So high inflation leads to high unemployment, whereas in the very short run, high inflation seems to lead to low unemployment. But that's in the immediate. But in the
short run,
short lag, high inflation causes unemployment.
Right. That's one of the great things about the expectations augmented Phillips curve, is that it fixes a lot of those problems based on individuals' expectations, right? So again, if you're expecting the inflation, you're not going to have anything good that happens. In fact, you're probably going to have bad things that happen, right? So if I know every year on the year that the Federal Reserve will have 1.5 to 2.5% inflation, because they're very bad at targeting inflation, because inflation is not something that you can really target, because there's a demand for money and velocity that changes, blah, 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 blah. But what I do know is that it's pretty good at staying within 1%. If I know that, I can plan accordingly. I can set my bonds up accordingly. I can purchase accordingly. I can set my interest rates for my company accordingly, and I can get interest rates accordingly, because I'll know that. The problem with inflation, the same problem with deflation, is that we don't know. We don't have that expectation. When that expectation falls, that's when bad things happen, right? So let's go back to the 1930s with the Nazi Germany, or pre-Nazi Germany, inflation, right? Everybody blames the inflation rate for being the rise of power to Hitler. That's absolutely not true. The rise of power to Hitler came when the deflation happened, because people had become used to the constant hyperinflation. The moment it went into deflation, that sent it into a spiral, because then money started going wonky, and people stopped being able to calculate how much money is worth something, and that is where a collapse happens.
Let's say the collapse happened in the hyperinflation. You can see it in Venezuela today, or Zimbabwe just a few years ago. It was the fact that you can't calculate hyperinflation. I mean, hyperinflation was so bad that people would go into a restaurant, order and pay, and then eat, because it would cost more at the end of the meal than it would at the beginning of the meal. So hyperinflation actually eliminates money. It just makes money worthless. Money is no longer valuable in a society. People have to go back to the barter system. Whereas in a deflation, money is king, right? Cash is king. So money becomes more valuable. So, and this is we're talking about a hyper-deflationary scenario. So I would also differentiate what type of deflation we're talking about, because you can have, like you said, supply, innovation and things like that make things less expensive. So this is like a supply push deflation versus deflation that's just a loss of the availability of money. So in the 1930s, you had drastic cuts by the Federal Reserve in the amount of money that they were putting out, and that's a negative type of deflation. That's very harmful to the economy when there is no money to be found. You had towns creating their own monetary. Actually, in 2008, you had the same thing happen. I think there was like 13 little towns that created their own money. So that's what happened in the 1930s when you get that type of deflation. So deflation in general, there's good and there's bad deflation, but deflation is not always bad. Deflation is actually a good thing in general. It's just that deflation is bad when it comes from a loss of money availability. So deflation is good, and we're sitting on computers here. What we would say deflation in terms of a reduction in the price of computers. We all enjoy that. We enjoy deflationary scenarios in the goods that we purchase. But if deflation just comes from a lack of availability of money, that is a bad thing. That was in the colonies. In fact, in the pre-Revolutionary War, there was massive deflation when the King of England made the use of Spanish doubloons and all the other currencies from around the world illegal. And so they really eliminated the availability of money in the colonies, which pretty much eliminated the economy. I mean, it really harms the economy. So inflation, hyperinflation is drastically terrible. It's a terrible thing. And deflation that comes from a loss of availability of money is a bad thing as well. But deflation, whereas it's just a fall in prices, is not. I don't really see any problem with that.
All right. So I'm gonna give you a reason why I have a problem with deflation. Yeah. So we both agree that deflation it has a general decrease in prices. It's a good thing because it gives consumers a greater purchasing power, and to some degree, moderate drops in certain products such as food and energy do have some positive impact on consumer spending, right?
And it also incentivizes savings. And, we both say that savings are a necessity for an economy, right? People need to save so that you can need a loan out, and that creates investment.
Right. So here's the problem. All right. So if you have an overall decline in asset prices, right, you're going to have producers are going to be forced to liquidate their inventories, right, that people don't want to buy. And consumers, investors alike began to hold on to liquid money, reversing the cushion against further loss. And as more money is saved, less money is spent, further decreasing aggregate demand, and further decreasing the supply of money, right? So the supply of money is based on the demand for money. If you hold on to liquid money, you're going to only decrease the amount of money in the system even more. That goes back to the Cambridge equation of exchange, right?
But I reject that.
Right. Well, you can,
because people the argument that deflation means people won't spend money, I find is ridiculous, because again,
I'm not saying that it doesn't spend money. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is,
I'm also saying that it doesn't mean that they're just going to have to liquidate their assets, because if the price of goods goes down, then the price of inputs goods will also go down, and they can renegotiate their prices with their suppliers.
Right. No, you can't do that fast. That's why we have this.
Deflation doesn't go that fast either, though.
Deflation is always faster than inflation.
Well, has the electronic industry collapsed? Has the movie industry collapsed? I mean, seems to me that they're doing pretty well.
At times they have, but I don't understand what that has to do with anything.
Well, I mean, I just say electronics is a great example of where the prices of goods has fallen over time dramatically.
No, they have not fallen. So we're using the word, we're talking about things at a different level, right? So prices of something, as they have generally trended forward, and the price is reducing, we're not going to say that that's a general price level drop, right? So that would be like your statement about demand side inflation. You say demand side inflation doesn't exist because that's just a few companies, right? I would say that demand side deflation doesn't necessarily have that problem. But that being said, that is still mostly forcing other companies to liquidate their inventories, right? Because people no longer want to buy those, right? As a new TV comes out, this TV is $300. This TV is $2,000. This TV is getting sold off. As this TV drops in price, that's because they're liquidating that inventory because people no longer want to buy this older TV at that $2,000 price, right? That's just a price mechanism working. That's not that, right? And you have to agree that there is a supply and demand for money. That is what the Cambridge equation of exchange does, is that it makes a supply and demand for money. And I don't know why we can't agree that there is a supply and a demand for money, and that equilibrium of supply and demand for money would be 0% inflation and 0% deflation.
I don't see what I'm arguing against that. I don't. Where was I arguing against that? Supply and demand for money. There's a supply of money, and there's people want money.
You said you rejected the Cambridge equation.
Well, no, I was rejecting the idea of you're saying that deflation. What would you say? Deflation means that people will stop spending, basically.
No,
people
I said that it would
to hold on to money.
Yeah, it increases people to hold on to liquid money because it's a cushion against further financial loss, right? So if you have a bunch of money in the bank and you know that the bank is getting ready to have a run on, you're going to pull your money out as fast as you can, and you're going to put it under your mattress. When you put it under your mattress, you reduce nominal gross domestic product because that money's not in the
puts it under their mattress.
They did in the 1930s, which caused the Great Depression.
Well, that was a completely different banking system.
No, and
it was under a different monetary system as well, essentially.
It was a quasi gold standard, but I mean, they still could inflate or deflate the money in the system. They could still do that, right? We didn't have inflation targeting. We did very low-level quantitative easing in that time. We did quantitative easing in the previous one. I think is 1921. In that recession, we did quantitative easing then. Quantitative easing isn't some new idea.
We didn't do anything in 1921.
Yes, we did. We pumped it as the lender of last resort. We pumped it full of money.
No, I don't think 1921 was the one that I don't believe they did anything. I know the federal government didn't do anything, and I don't think the monetary system did anything. That was a very short recession. 1930, 31 or so, the Great Depression. So,
okay, I'm sorry. You're right. I said 1921. It was the 1907 where J.P. Morgan pumped money into the system to save it, as he was the lender of last resort, and his work set up the passing of the Owen Glass Federal Reserve Act because we've seen how well it worked when he pumped money into the system.
Well, I think there are claims, I think they're valid, that he and his group really drove those recessions and then came in as the great savior, and he got the Federal Reserve Act passed. They tried to pass it in 1911, 1912, and finally got it. But as far as recessions and depressions, the paper by, and I was trying to find this where I had it, Atkinson and Cahill conclude the data suggests that deflation is not closely related to depressions. A broad historical look finds more periods of deflation with reasonable growth than with depression, and many more periods of depression with inflation than deflation. Overall, the data show virtually no link between deflation and depression. The authors caution, however, that their study characterizes the relation of the raw data between deflation and output growth. So this is a paper that was published, I think, in 2012, where because of what happened in the Great Depression, people tend to link deflation with depression because that was one period of time where you had deflation and depression. But historically, deflation has been linked with growth. In the 1920s, you had huge amounts of growth, and you also had periods of deflation, whereas periods of recession have actually, in reality, been linked with periods of economic recession. And that would be, again, kind of the Austrian theory that the inflation causes the recessions and depressions because of the manipulation of the investments. So talk about the business cycle and all that. But inflation basically is just that inflation, it manipulates investors. It causes them to invest in poor investments because they think they're looking at nominal and not real. They think, and because it looks like they're going to get 3% growth, but inflation then eats away at all of their profit potential, and eventually they lose money and go out of business. So,
right. So I was just checking to see where the inflation rates of from 1900 to 1950. The only time that we see any growth out of this system really was a time of actual high inflation. Other than that, the deflationary period is the actual recession. So, but that's
I would say GDP or real growth, because I mean I think you could probably say that World War II would give you a big boost in GDP, but there was obviously no growth there.
Well, no. What I was going to say is, regardless of that, is that how we measured inflation then is completely irrelevant to what inflation actually is. Again, that goes back to, at the time, we still had an idea that inflation is connected with money. Inflation is not connected with money in so much that you can have trillions of dollars in a system dumped tomorrow. It would not cause inflation. Because if it's not being spent, it doesn't actually happen. It's not actually in the system, right? Nobody could just say, well, there's trillions of dollars, automatically it's inflation, right? So,
well, it's going to cause inflation somewhere.
No, it'll just cause inflation on the ground because nobody's using it, right?
Well, if you were to dump it into a big hole, then yes. But if you're going to...
All right, so we agree to that, right? We agree that you have to have money being spent for it to be countered into...
If they just created $500 trillion and they buried it in the sea, that would be like if you found a big, massive supply of gold and you dumped it in the Mariana, or the diamond industry, right? They had a massive safe of diamonds. They were going to dump it in a trench. Basically, the money was never really created because and that's the problem with paper money, right?
No, it's not.
Is that you can just create it out of nothing, and it is inflationary.
Let's not do this. Let's not do this. Let's stick to inflation. Let's not go into
paper money is inflationary by its very nature.
It doesn't have to. It can equal growth. Therefore, it's backed exactly by the production.
But that could never happen.
It has.
It's never happened. You can never have paper money back. And in fact, historically, paper money has always gone into hyperinflation. Can you list the number of times where a gold standard went into hyperinflation? Never, right?
Yeah. No, actually I can. Hold on. Hyperinflation, 1740. Let's see.
1790.
80, or it's 1790. Okay. 18.
Where though? No gold standard.
In America.
No, that was they printed money. They printed the Continental. Paper money. 1790 in France, right? Fiat money inflation in France, 5-year period. And that's where you get the revolution. That's where you get Napoleon, right? So,
but that paper money is
total destruction of the economy.
No. It's not paper money. It's paper money directly backed by gold. It's not actual gold being handed between each other. It's paper money.
No, it wasn't backed by gold.
Yes, it was. The Continental wasn't. The Continental wasn't. But I stated before the Continental, and I stated after the Continental when during the Civil War, which I think there was a small.
There's no gold backing though.
They might have took it off of the gold.
Lincoln's greenbacks.
Yeah, like I said, they took it off.
Gold. You can't print. You can't
print.
Shut
the fuck up for a second. God damn it! Let me finish.
You're researching anyways.
God damn it! Let me finish.
So in France, it was supposedly backed by the land that they stole from the church, but they just kept printing, and they say, "Hey, that worked." What you would get is you'd get a boost in the economy, and then prices would rise at the end of that, and the economy would go back to where it was or worse. And so they printed more money, and you get a little boost, and prices would rise, and you go back to where it was. Fiat money inflation in France, a great little 100-page book. The Continental was I guess there was a phrase, it's worth a Continental or something like that, because they totally destroyed that currency. It was completely worthless. The greenbacks, nobody even knows about the greenbacks because they weren't worth anything either. But none of these were backed by gold. They were, again, the fiat money inflation in France, they were allegedly backed by the church by property that they stole from the Catholic Church. But they didn't actually back it with anything. They just kept printing and printing and printing. So, but that's paper money. So paper money originated in China in, I think, the 1300s or so, and it lasted about 5 years, and people didn't want it anymore. It lasted longer than that, but people didn't want it because it lost its value so fast. You can go to, historically, paper money has never lasted very long. So in the United States, a pure fiat system, 1971, right? 1971 was the end of the gold standard, Nixon. And so since then, you've seen a rapid growth in inflation has never been higher than under the paper system, under a pure paper, because we went off the gold standard in World War I. We went off the gold standard in the Great Depression. We went off the gold standard in, I think, 1892. So many times they've gone off the gold standard and you've seen inflationary periods.
Right, but okay, so
15-20%.
All right, so now that you can shut up. So those times that we went off the gold standard, those were very serious circumstances of problems, right? We agree. Those are wars. I don't know of any other time in American history that we just randomly went off of it. It's typically been around war, right?
1933, March 1st, I believe it was, March 21st.
Yeah.
FDR's first act.
Right. Brilliant idea.
But it was 1921 we didn't go off the gold standard, and that was a much worse recession, but it only lasted a year and a half. It didn't last 10 years.
That's because the Federal Reserve acted in accordance due to J.P. Morgan's influence and the current president who had left. Right, the president of that Federal Reserve was not the same as the next one, and the next one didn't do as good because he didn't really believe in the Federal Reserve as being a lender of last resort in the same respect that.
Because they printed a mass amount of money and they inflated and then they deflated in the 1930s. So every time the economy starts to pick up,
they never inflated. Milton Friedman discovered this. They never once inflated the system. They couldn't.
No, that's not true because he writes about it. Him and his wife have I think they have a few papers on the Great Depression.
They don't. It's not him and his wife.
They inflated and then they started to deflate.
It's Anna Schwartz. It's Anna Schwartz, and it's not him and his wife. And
Anna Schwartz.
Yeah, and he even stated that they could not inflate the system because they could not figure out how to get the money to people because people could not use it. People were not using the money. They were stuffing it in mattresses and stupid shit like that, which goes back to what I was talking about earlier about how inflation actually works, that money has to be spent. You can put trillions of dollars into the system. If people are not using it, then it's not going to be inflation. Quantitative easing, right? Trillions of dollars was dumped into the system. We have not seen a lick of inflation from it.
I would disagree because we have seen inflation in the stock market.
No, we have not.
Where did the money go? The money went into the stock market.
It's the stock market grows, man. That's what it does. I don't know what to tell you.
Where'd the money come from? Stock market grows because it has money into it, right? It requires an infusion of money for it to grow. The demand has to come from somewhere. Demand has to come from somebody with money. Banks, right? The money went to central bank or went to banks, and the banks put the money in the market, right?
No, it's not what happened.
The money went to Europe too. About $1 trillion went to Europe.
Dude, the Federal Reserve has a huge balance sheet. Huge, right? So the Fed Reserve balance sheet, it's something outrageous. Give me a second.
How are they going to get the money back? How are they going to suck the money back? Because that's what Ben Bernanke said. He wouldn't have a problem doing that.
What are you talking about?
Well, they put the money out there, right? The trillions of dollars, and they're going to have to.
They didn't put it out there. They never put it out there. So what they did is they let it go into the reserves of banks where it just sits. And it sits just enough for these banks to have capital so that if a run-on happens, they can do it.
Well, it's more complicated than that. They sent it
No,
out
it's not.
to banks.
No, it's not.
The Federal Reserve started paying interest on the deposits that the banks keep at the Federal Reserve, right? 2008, they did it for the first time ever, about $500 billion. They went from almost zero to $500 billion in no time flat in Federal Reserve banks, right? The banks were holding their reserves at the Fed because it's risk-free. It's a risk-free deposit. They get about 0.5% interest rate on it.
Which wasn't far from. So you're talking about the Federal Reserve window, right?
We're talking about money. Money was printed, and then the Federal Reserve, in order to keep it, they started paying interest on the money. They lent it at the banks, and then they paid them to keep it at the Fed, right?
Not really. No, it's not.
No, they did. They did.
It's not how that works. You don't just get to give the Federal Reserve money and they hold it for you. You borrow money from the Federal Reserve. It doesn't hold anything.
Yeah, it does.
It holds security from the U.S. Treasury.
No, the Federal Reserve banks can.
And it buys stuff.
They can keep their excess reserves at the Federal Reserve.
No, they don't.
They paid them.
They trade reserves between each other. That's called that's the purpose of your reserve window, is that banks trade reserves between each other, not the Federal Reserve. They can trade from the Federal Reserve, but it's a loan.
That's the Fed funds rate, but they can keep money at the bank.
No. The Fed funds rate is a bit different than the reserve window, right? The reserve window is right. So I'm a bank. I don't have enough reserves.
Yes, I know. That's what I'm saying. That's completely different. That's a completely different thing.
Right, but that's what happens. They don't just give the Federal Reserve money, and the Federal Reserve goes, "Oh, what do I do with this money?"
They're legally required to hold reserves with the Federal Reserve. In August 2008, banks held $1.9 billion in such reserves, just a bit to the legally required minimum. In January 2015, they hold $2.6 trillion in such reserves. That is bank reserves multiplied by a factor of more than 13,000, far above the legally required minimum, which barely moved during this time. So this is hold reserves with the Federal Reserve. U.S. banks are legally required to hold reserves with the Federal Reserve. It went from $1.9 billion in August of 2008. Then the Fed started paying interest, and it went in January 2015, it was $2.6 trillion. Excess reserve notions of cash and economic commentary published by the Fed Bank of Cleveland.
Right. Back to the actual.
For October of 2008, the Fed paid no interest in excess reserves.
So selected assets of the Federal Reserve, the total Federal Reserve assets right now is about 45,000 billion. And the securities held outright is 25. That's U.S. Treasury securities and mortgage-backed securities. That is around $3,500 billion. Right. So currency in circulation is below 15, or is it right at 1,500 billions? The Treasury balance is well below that. And then we've got deposits of depository institutions, right? Is that what you're talking about? The deposit ratio? I'm really, the deposits and depository institutions. Are you talking about them? Never mind. Anyway, that's at roughly 2,250 billions, right? So this bank sheet is absolutely huge, and all of that money got dumped into the system. None of that inflation touched anything. You can bounce and say it was the stock market, but even if it was the stock market, that amount of money would be much greater than that in the stock market. We would see.
Well, I pointed out that it also went back to the Fed. Yes. So, but there is some inflation, but a lot of the inflation went into the stock market. And I think as soon as the Fed starts to pull that money back, it's going to cause the stock market to retract. So with 36 seconds left, I say inflation eats away at people's savings. It disincentivizes people to save, and it causes people to go out and be risky with their assets. Savings is a necessity for economic growth because investment comes from savings. Nobody today actually puts their money in a mattress. In certain periods, it's rational to do that, but that's not what happens today. That's not what happens to anybody. So inflation is a bad thing. Deflation is not always a bad thing. It's not necessarily a bad thing.
Logically inconsistent.